Eddie. Thank you very much for that kind welcome, and thanks to everybody who's involved in organising this. I'm thinking in particular of Anhara Elias and Nia Davis, arranged all the arrangements for tonight and for the kind invite from Ellen to talk about this issue. I'm going to be talking about language dynamics from the point of view of ethnolinguistic vitality. But before I start, just to acknowledge and recognize the team. I haven't done this by myself. And the people working with me are Daniel Bourgeois from Moncton in New Brunswick in Canada, Brian O'Kernan from Dublin, and then two esteemed colleagues from the UH at the Language Science Institute, Ian Campbell and Gorston Cameron. And there's a lot of diagrams involved because obviously a dynamic, there's circular movement, so we have to be able to understand the movements. The starting point for this work, obviously we reviewed the literature. There's a fairly extensive literature on ethnolinguistic vitality, and the working assumption is that ethnolinguistic vitality is dependent on language dynamics in society functioning according to interrelated and mutually reinforcing societal processes. But we had these persistent questions as we were going through the literature, trying to embellish or enhance the scholarship on ethnolinguistic diversity. And I'll ask you to think about these as we're working our way through this new dynamic we have and see if we answer these by the time we come to the end. The first is, what accounts for the insufficient focus on minority societal dynamics in language policy and planning? You see LPP, language policy and planning. The second is, how has much of the current LPP, language policy and planning, how has it become so misaligned with societal challenges supporting ethno-linguistic vitality? In other words, the LPP that we have doesn't really support ethno-linguistic vitality. The third point is, why is much of the formal minority language policy and planning avoidant of the challenging minority language socio-cultural reality? In other words, the policy and planning we have isn't sufficiently addressing the level of crisis that is out there in our minorities. And the fourth point then is why, which in academia, this tends to be the dominant one in the language sciences, modern language sciences, why is the post-structuralist, what I mean by that is the individualized or sectoralized approach to minority language issues, why is this non-optimal for language policy and planning? Or put it very, forgive me for speaking so directly and so bluntly, why does the post-structuralist approach to these issues not work, basically? And this is what we're going to try to answer today.
Oh gosh, I don't know if I want to do that. Do I?
No.
Hide? Okay.
There we go. Right. This work is essentially building on previous work with the colleagues, but I want to mention this paper with myself and Brian O'Kernan from the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, published in the Rutledge Handbook of Language Policy and Planning. And what we neglect sometimes in minority language policy and planning is that there is majority policy and planning, of course, and that planning is much more successful because of the social power and the political power of the group. Often it doesn't need to be formalized. It's not stated in a way, but it still exists. And we come up with this new formula where language policy and planning works for the minority. We call that language promotion and protection. In other words, that you're promoting the language, but you're protecting the speaker group that exists already. When language policy doesn't work, or the dynamic with the dominant group is too strong, what happens with minority language policy, it descends into what we call language neglect and demotion. In other words, it's negatively affecting the group rather than helping the group. The second main insight from this paper, we came up with this two axes approach, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. And if the power trajectory on those axes is positive, that is beneficial to the minority. If it's negative, it does harm. In other words, you see here in the fourth quadrant, we set it out a different way in the new paper, but where we have the pressures on, this is praxis, in other words, the use of it, and the horizontal axis, that's identity, affiliation, where the identity isn't strong enough with the minority culture and group. Well, if those two axes are heading, if the power dynamic in that is heading in the wrong direction, that is the direction towards erasure, that the group is losing its societal position. Now, I mentioned at the start, there is a long literature on this, probably going back to Giles's paper, very famous paper in the 70s, right up to last year, our paper on language protection, language dynamic. Probably the most famous one approach to this is Joshua Fishman's approach on the EGIDS scale, the generational disruption scale. We believe that we've built on these, of course. We believe, of course, that we've enhanced this model now with the new approach. Okay, and just to indicate, I don't have time to go through it now, there is data and insights and sociolinguistic analysis behind this, and that's giving an indication of some of the work we've done, especially in the Irish and Scottish Gaelic context. I'm not going to go in too much, but yes, there'll be an example of it later on. We show how we apply this data to the approach we have. Okay, getting into we call it the LANS approach. So it's language dynamics in society, from which we get LANS. And there are 4 key concepts, or general tenets, and they are direction, process, participation, and competition. And these operate according to 4 developmental stages. And they are language transmission and acquisition, socialization, civic expansion, and coherent ethnicization. We'll have diagrams and we'll be able to explain it in some detail as we go ahead. Okay, if we start then with the general concepts, the key concepts, we'll start with direction. In ethnolinguistic diversity, there's the transfer of skills from one generation to the next. So in other words, if the mother and father speak to their children, that's transferring the language and the cultural skills associated with it through the generations. So that operates on a vertical axis. Okay. The horizontal axis then, that is practice in communities, in schools, in social situations. So this is, we can see we have the 2 axes working in tandem again. Now, this is the first diagram, and just what's outlined here in orange. So you can see there the vertical axis moving from the primary transfer of the language down to socialized transfer on the vertical axis. So that's from previous generations down to the young. And then we have practice, social practice, schools, communities, civic bodies, so on and so forth, over to civic and socioeconomic practice. In other words, how the social practice becomes more developed, more elaborate as it gains more civic realms. Okay, we can now move on to the second key concept, and that is process. So in other words, that's the dynamic progression through different developmental stages. And we identify 4 stages, we refer to them as quadrants, okay? The first developmental process, that's acquisition in transmission, referring to primary socialization of the language and its culture. The second process then is the social reinforcement of the initial acquisition, and we call that secondary socialization, the socialization of the language and the culture in its peer group, okay? So it's beyond the family, but it's still informal. The third developmental process then, that is civic reinforcement. What has been experienced prior to that as familial transmission, social reinforcement in peer group now gets a civic reinforcement. And then the fourth developmental process, we refer to that as coherent ethnicization. In other words, that means that the people who affiliate or adhere to this culture, they feel that that identity is meaningful to them personally and meaningful to them as a collective group. This is what gives the coherence. What is felt personally and what is felt collectively becomes coherent. And this indicates now, going back to the same, what we have here is the functional, this general societal processes of a functional culture moving from the one developmental process to the next. So here we have quadrant 1, as mentioned, transmission and acquisition. Quadrant 2, socialization, reinforcement of what has been acquired. Quadrant 3, the civic expansion of that culture into broader civic realms. And in other words, that's the institutional personality of the language and its group. And then 4th quadrant then is the ethnicization and the feeling of collective coherence of the group. Okay. The third general or key concept or general tenet, as we refer to them in the forthcoming publication, participants. So basically social players, okay? So we have first language speakers of minority language and majority language, of course, second, third language speakers in many circumstances, fourth language in multicultural situations. There are the participants in the first language minority culture. Watch out for these numbers in the next series of diagrams coming up. We'll see where they fall into the dynamic. There are participants in the majority culture, participants in the minority tangential culture. I'll explain a tangent to the minority. I'll explain that in a second when I come to it. And then there are the participants in the neo-culture of the minority group. And again, I'll explain to that. And then, of course, we have our community and sectoral leaders. And the fourth key concept, or general tenet, is the notion of competition. There is competition between the different participants or the different social players in these various developmental stages. A dynamic trajectory occurs when the movement through the developmental stages helps to build confidence and capacity. That comes from a positive distribution of power in favor of the minority. However, in any dynamic, you can have an anti-dynamic or an anti-trajectory. That's when the developmental stages of the minority are interrupted or interfered with, and that leads to a situation where we have majoritarian power. In other words, the power of the majority exerting itself in the social context or the developmental processes of the minority. Okay, now we're able to go into the different, are we okay so far? Are we getting general concepts and processes? Okay, just think circularly. It's going around in a dynamic. This is what we're bringing to the party, I think. The existing models of ethnolinguistic vitality, they are too linear, that you go from one stage to the next. What we've introduced here is an axis, and there is a circular movement there. And unless you go through the process, you are not going to build the ethnolinguistic vitality. In other words, the existing models are not showing the dynamic circular element to what you need to do to maintain ethnolinguistic vitality. Right. We'll start trying to adapt to the different cultural groups. Okay. And we're going to start off here with the minority culture. There are still native speakers of many minority cultures throughout the globe. So obviously then there is transmission of that culture in quadrant 1. Okay. Then they practice that language in youth peer group. In cases where they have civic support, they'll go into the 3rd quadrant. And then if there's a feeling that there is collective solidarity among that group, well, then they're into the process then of coherent ethnicization. You see what I'm doing with the band or the flow for the minority culture? It starts off thicker and then it gets reduced as it moves through the different quadrants. Well, we do it like that because in most minority situations, they are undergoing language shift. So in other words, they are losing part of their demos, part of their population as they move from one quadrant to the next. And this is why we've added generation 1, generation +1. A successful culture will go through this dynamic process and reproduce it into the next generation. A culture undergoing language shift is only bringing forward a weaker demographic group than the previous group that existed prior to that. In other words, that is the process of what we know as language shift or ethnolinguistic erasure. Okay, and you can see it here. The quadrant 1, primary socialization, quadrant 2, secondary socialization, quadrant 3, civic reinforcement, and quadrant 4 there is formalized identities, that the identity feels coherent individually and collectively. Now we can introduce the majoritarian or the majority culture, okay? And again, you can see the dynamic of flow. It's a band that is flowing through these different quadrants. We've seen before the contracting band for the minority. What is happening with the majoritarian culture? It starts off smaller than it is because, for example, if we take the dominant language in the Anglosphere, there are many more learners of English than there are native speakers of English. So therefore, it's as the Anglosphere, members of the Anglosphere go through these different quadrants, that language is gaining more power. And they bring more speakers into the next generation of the cycle. The other point that's salient here is we put the majoritarian culture outside of the minority culture. Why? Because the majority culture envelops. The minority culture does not exist without some type of relationship in all these developmental quadrants. This is why we have this idea of competition. The minority speakers have to compete in every quadrant to maintain their ethno-linguistic vitality. Okay, this is where it becomes complicated. If we look at the minority culture now, I'm going to introduce this group here, the tangential culture, okay? And you'll see where I've placed it. The tangential culture, they are speakers of a minority language that can adhere to the minority group, but they are not native speakers of it. The difference between the tangential members of the tangential culture and the neoculture is that they have experienced the lived social reality of the minority speakers. So, for example, they haven't been raised in the minority language, but they've seen the minority language as it is practiced in normal social settings. In other words, the tangentials do not rely on the school system alone to be speakers of the minority language. This is why as they become confident speakers of the minority group, then they are able to participate in civic bodies, schooling, education, university life, get involved in language promotion bodies. So they are able to, even though they haven't experienced these fully, transmission or secondary socialization, they are able then to partake in the civic reinforcement and in the public discourses about what minority identity is. So they can contribute progressively then in quadrants 3 and 4, the civic arena and the ethnicization arena. Okay. We'll add on then the neoculture or the neo-identity. And again, they're a band, but they are connected to the majority culture. The reason for that is their relationship to the minority culture is based on the symbolic value that the majority gives to the minority culture. In other words, they are dependent on the school system, or some of the importance that the nation state they live in attaches to the symbolic recognition of the minority group. In other words, it is more symbolic than lived as in comparison to the tangential people. The people involved in the neoculture, they can operate in a positive dynamic or they can operate in a negative dynamic. When the emphasis in the neoculture is basically on the minority language as a school subject or as a symbolic, an element of symbolic culture, well, that's anti-dynamic because it's not helping with these societal processes that the other minority speakers or the tangential speakers are helping with. However, as tangentials have become involved in the civic reinforcement, as they gain greater knowledge of the minority culture, they can have a positive dynamic if it goes beyond the ideology of a school subject or the ideology of a symbolic attachment to the language. Okay. The other point we have to recognize also is that there is an assimilatory pull. So what I mean by that is, in every single developmental stage in the 4 quadrants, there is a pull away from the minority culture, even if it is first language minority culture, tangential, or neoculture. And this is what we're indicating here. So families are small, intimate groups that cannot complete the language transmission process. In other words, they are losing those speakers over the majority culture. Where there is disruption to the socialization process in the young peer group, we can use the example of Irish speakers in the Gaeltacht not using their native spoken Irish in their peer group. So in other words, they are using English as the medium of peer group socialization. So they are being lost then in this stage to the majority culture. In many minority cultures, there is very little civic reinforcement. So the minority culture in that situation only pertains to transmission and some peer group, and then it is lost in the civic realm, and it becomes very confused then. It lacks coherence in the 4th ethnicization realm. Okay. Right. Just before we move into the brief discussion at the end, there is a tension. This is part of the reason why I asked these questions about language policy and planning at the start. If we look at the 2 spheres of this general dynamic, if we take what is on your left, what is outlined here in orange, these are emic or in-group concerns. So these are intimate and local, basically. Language policy and planning really doesn't have a lot to say about these. When it comes down to brass tacks and concrete proposals and concrete support processes, it doesn't really have a lot to say. If we compare that then to the other side, of the quadrants 3 and 4, they are ectic, or outgroup concerns, generally civic concerns. In general, minority language policy and planning is overemphasized on this, on quadrant 3, and it generally supports, mainly through the universities and its support for the minority language intelligentsia, debates relating to formal identities, who is a member of the minority group, and all these type of discourses that we have. The difficulty we have is these are probably more important to ethnolinguistic survival than the processes of quadrants 3 and 4. That is not to say we can discard 3 and 4, but you cannot have socially dynamic language policy without an equal emphasis on all the processes. This is why we use the phrase comprehensiveness and complementarity in language policy for the minority. Okay. Now, from combining the processes with the general concepts, we can come up with a new definition of ethno-linguistic vitality. We hope to publish this as a fairly lengthy article later on in the year. And this is the definition our team has come up with Ethnolinguistic vitality ensues from the collective and organizational capacity of a language group to protect and regenerate key communal and social, institutional and civic processes, which are critical to the societal stability and continuity of the ethno-linguistic group. In other words, the group goes through the processes, gaining from each quadrant, gaining from each developmental stage, or the group has to deal with language fragility, language endangerment, rather than what they're aiming for, which is language vitality. Okay, right. This is a bit negative now, but this is about facing reality. Unless we can start addressing the different developmental aspects of what is entailed with ethno-linguistic vitality, we refer to this as language promotion without sufficient language protection. We're promoting something which we are not protecting. And then we are wondering why the language policy doesn't work. The language policy doesn't work because it is not dynamic enough. It is not focused on the issues at hand. If we continue with this style of language promotion without protection, what is going to happen for these minority groups is that they will end up as marginal, peripheral, non-vernacular speakers of a non-vernacular secondary language, which is subject to majoritarian control and sanction. In other words, they will only survive in a civic realm as long as the majority culture has patience for them. That's no basis for survival. The second point, what type of acquisition? If we're not going to protect transmission and socialization, primary and secondary socialization, what type of acquisition are we going to have? And I'm borrowing a phrase here from the French scholar Louis-Jean Calvet. Programmed acquisition, in other words, that is the reliance on schooling and on politically sponsored identitarian assertions. In other words, we learn the language in school and then we pretend that it has a coherent identity when it doesn't really in society. And then the third point is that of the limited social function of the minority language in the erosion of first language possibilities. So the only option there, when there's no protection, is that the acquisition will become optional for a low status language with no vernacular lived culture. And we talk about this syndrome in our 2020 publication. When I was working on these, this negative prognosis of what's going to happen if we can develop feasible ethno-linguistic vitality, the famous preface that Jean-Paul Sartre had in Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, he said, demanding yet denying the human condition makes for an explosive contradiction. That's basically, we are causing a contradiction in minority language policy and planning because the option there for the human condition isn't realizable with that type of thinking. Okay. To give this practical effect, the type of a case study for what, and Eileen's very kind introduction, we've done plenty of field work in Ireland. We've done plenty in Scotland as well. This probably applies to Scotland as well. We just will take the Irish case study to take it out of the UK state. Okay. And we'll look at what is happening to native spoken Irish and Irish language identity in the independent state, the Republic of Ireland. Okay. And this is, by the way, you have to remember, the Irish language in Ireland has been subject to 100 years of language policy and planning. It's probably the most planned minority language. And I would say some of the most ambitious language policy and planning that we have in the globe also. What is happening in quadrant 1 with Irish? Well, the native speaking group has contracted to around 20,000 people. out of a population of around 5 million in the southern state. So in quadrant 1, we are losing the demography of native spoken Irish. So therefore, there is very little transfer and acquisition. Even where we have transfer, I can point to other documents and other pieces of research that indicate it is more typical for the young native speakers of Irish in the Gaeltacht region to speak English to their peers. So the language of youth socialization is English. So that means this is down as well, secondary socialization. So quadrants 1 and 2 aren't being, they are not being, the criteria is not being fulfilled dynamically. We move to quadrant 3 then, civic elaboration. This has gone up because a group that comes up with a new idea or a new institutional wheeze, if they can persuade the civil servants, they will get money. This sector continues to expand. I put a question mark beside it. I think you can answer why I put the question mark. How can that be civic elaboration when there's not sufficient focus on transmission and socialization in the first 2 primary developmental spheres? The fourth, what level of coherent ethnicization do the Irish speakers of Ireland have? And I've put the arrow here going the other way, meaning it is in it has a better relationship with the majority English-speaking culture than it does with Irish-speaking culture. And I put the question mark as well. How can that be considered coherent when the type of civic politics we have informing language policy and planning disregards the social or societal erasure of the native speaking group? There is no way those processes of ethnicization can be coherent when it disregards the societal reality of the native speaking group. Okay, so I'm given the case study. This is not an Irish condition. This is a condition that flows from the formalized stance that we have in forming language policy and planning. So the limitations with this of suggesting promotional measures without engaging in protection. What does it lead to? Well, it prioritizes institutional concerns over communal struggles. It ignores the lived reality. It causes this syndrome where it overshadows societal vulnerability via symbolic engagement with communal threats. It creates a false sense of security that the institutional approach can compensate for social weaknesses. In other words, ignore society and then talk about institutions. I'll come back to that in a second. It also builds this tension between the formal ideology and it undermines the credibility of the minority language policy and planning because it is disregarding social reality. And then because it is disregarding the societal reality, it is not really focused on ethnolinguistic vitality. The language bodies themselves then become implicated in the demise. Because they are not addressing the primary issues. Okay. Then, just to define very quickly again, what I mean by the post-structuralist approach, that is the emphasis on the individualized or the sectoralized experience of the minority language, rather than emphasizing its social practice and its societal reality. Well, in emphasizing this individualized perspective and this sectoralized perspective, they have created the institutional conditions for a de-societalized view. They have taken society out of the language policy and planning approach. Also, they have propagated a confused sociology. You don't know what they're dealing with sociologically. And then This leads to what I refer to as naive minority language policy and minority language politics. It's the politics of assertion rather than the politics that is facing up to the issues. And then it leads, unfortunately, to this neoliberal concept of a consumerist or a user aesthetic. That a language is there just to use when you want and discard when you want also. That is what is leading to the anti-collective dynamic, anti-collective ethic, as I say. Right. That's examples of the sectoralism. You can go through many minority language situations where they have policy and planning for that minority group. What do they emphasize? Schooling, arts, academia, language promotion, advocacy bodies, and then the symbolic use of the minority language in civic administration. How much does that compare to the developmental, or how much of that is relevant to the 4 developmental processes? It's relevant basically to quadrant 3 and a bit of quadrant 4. In this, if this is the emphasis, this type of civic emphasis, that is going to lead to a system of clientelist privilege. So the people that rise to the top of these sectors, they have inordinate power then over the remaining minority group, because it's the state that gives them their power through whatever leverage they get out of the minority policy and planning. Okay. Drawing to an end, if we can look at the issue of the participants, and well, we've talked about the majority culture, so we have the pragmatic majoritarians. So these are the beneficiaries of majority language policy and planning. We have the remnants, the societal remnants of the minority language societal culture. They are the L1 speakers of the minoritized language civilization. And these can be beneficiaries in some circumstances of this symbolic emphasis that the state puts on the minority culture. This is what maintains the language politics, even though it's insufficient. We have the empathetic minority language speakers. These are the L2 adherents to the remaining civilization. These basically are tangential speakers. And I refer to these as the communitarian proponents of a DIY language and society approach. They make it up themselves. They've seen the culture in action and they want to participate and help out to the best of their ability. There is another group, of course, civic beneficiaries, and these are the minority language L2 speakers, but they're divorced from the challenging situation of the minority language culture. They participate in a language in institutions approach. So we can see the tension there already. What the minority language group needs is a language in society approach. What the symbolic policy gives them is a language in institutions approach. Institutions are never going to compensate for societal weaknesses. Okay. If I can go into a bit more detail on the civic beneficiaries, those participating in the language and institutions approach. In emphasizing their needs over other needs of different types of minority language speakers, what is happening because of this approach is that we have a decoupling of minority language L2 provision from the L1 reality. L1 and L2 become dissociated from each other. It prioritizes a de-societalized focus on social and political challenges. It's creating the conditions for an atomized civic subject. In other words, a standardized minority language participant, rather than the real blood and guts lived reality of people who live in these societies. And then I've mentioned this already, the disregard then of L1 difficulties in emphasizing L2 symbolic needs. The end point of this is this type of policy, in its disregard of social challenges, you end up with uniformity because there's no emphasis on acquisition, primary socialization, secondary socialization. What is left at that stage is only the second language or the secondary language experience of the minority culture. That then becomes uniform. Okay, so what are then the perverse outcomes of promotion without protection? Well, if we're not going to protect what exists in society, in the in situ lived reality of the minority language and culture, well, with the in language shift dynamics, we are losing the demographic basis to that culture. Therefore, there is less capacity to deal with the issues that is causing the ongoing erosion of the societal salience. Rigidities then emerge in the official responsiveness to the challenges. And with this approach, a loss of capacity and official rigidity, this is creating the conditions for an intractable problem. In other words, it is a problem that has no solution because the diagnosis is not focused on the problem. Okay, right, we'll just take a break for a second. In any situation where you have a non-optimal policy approach, there are going to be winners and losers. And if we look at, on your left, who are the winners in this approach of promotion with no protection? The winners, obviously, the indifferent majority language speakers, complacent politicians, complacent corporate and sectoral leaders, the elite class in language policy and planning bodies, what I refer to here as those involved in a societal minority language scholarship. In other words, people who study the language with no reference to the lived reality of that culture and its civilization as it exists nowadays. So I should point out that some of my best friends are philologists, by the way, and I was trained as one myself. The other beneficiaries of this approach, those involved in the new speaker ideologies, and those who are interested in the minority language cultural consumption, the minority language leisure class, corresponding to Thorsten Veblen set out the sociology of the leisure class. These people are probably less moneyed than he was talking about, but it's the same syndrome, that they like the minority language as leisure pursuit rather than something that is societally vital and important to them. And of course, the current L2 users benefit from this approach, but the civic approach, especially as it relates to schooling, helps out. Right. Who are the losers then in promotion without protection? Obviously, the existing members of the L1 communities that are in demographic contraction are experiencing language shift. The L2 speakers who benefited from the minority culture, in other words, the tangentials, the people who sought, and they became good speakers because they lived in among the speakers themselves. They sought the language in action. The third group, who are going to be losers, the minority language learners who have an interest in the collective culture rather than in the minority language as a school subject or as a symbolic endeavor. Then the minority language learners who have an interest in the social capital, the minority, the L1 group, and also aesthetic practitioners who have a societal focus. And ultimately, this is the irony of it, ultimately, the big winners of the coming from the lack of focus on L1 realities are going to be the learners themselves in the end, when there is no extant lived L1 community. How are they going to learn a language that has no community of vernacular or native speakers? This is an issue that is not addressed in the post-structuralist sociolinguistics or in the current emphasis we have on sectoralism in language policy and planning. Okay, right. I'll leave that one. I'll just come to the, I'll leave that one. I'll come to the end. How do we start addressing this reality? If we can agree that existing language policy and planning is insufficient to the level of societal challenge, it is not focused on the dynamic requirements that the survival of a minority group has, in other words, moving from one developmental stage to the next in this progressive interrelatedness of the different concepts in the different quadrants. Well, the only way out of this is face reality, comprehend the level of interrelational dynamic support that is required, first of all, to help the socialization of the young minority speakers, and then to help them become part of something that is dynamic and meaningful to them. The way to do that is to these five approaches, I think. We need to emphasize the politics of empowerment in minority language strategy. In other words, we move away from this overemphasis, this over-reliance on language institutions, and we turn our focus to language in society. And we talk about empowering the group in the societal situation they are in at the minute. The second point is we move away from this symbolic approach to the minority culture. We start prioritizing socioeconomic and community development requirements and needs that these groups have. There is not sufficient emphasis on that issue at all. We need to emphasize social diversity in the policy, a policy that encourages complementarity between the second language speakers and the first language speakers. How can we have complementarity when the challenging first language reality is ignored in the policy, basically? A policy is favoring the symbolic and the use of the minority language as a second language in institutional settings. There can be no complementarity with that approach. We emphasize the issue of culture in society rather than culture in civic realms. That will entail rebalancing a positive aesthetic sensibility for minority cultures and engagement with societal reality of the community of speakers. And then, fourthly, this is what we're trying to start here with this dynamic approach in the lands project that we have. This is an ongoing endeavor. It is going to need research report, but research report that is based on realistic politics, realistic sociology, and realistic diagnostics of societal challenge, rather than the approach at the minute, which is based on assertions and naive thinking that we have in long established post-structuralist language policy and planning. And to sum it up in one sentence, this is difficult, it is multi-layered, it is dynamic, it is working on different axes at the same time, but the only way to give people hope is that we start addressing their concerns in a strategic way that is informed by credible diagnostics of the challenge. What we have at the minute is not credible diagnostically. Let's start about forming a research agenda that is based on diagnostic reality of the challenges involved. I'll leave it like that. Thank you very much. You've been very patient.